The snow fell in curtains that night, not the gentle, romantic kind that people painted on holiday cards, but the merciless, blinding kind that turned the world into a wall of white and swallowed sound whole. It buried the pine trees up to their shoulders. It filled the sacred grove of Iron Crest with a cold so profound it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. 370 wolves stood in a circle around the ancient bonfire, and they were laughing. At the center of that circle stood a young woman named Mara Voss. She was 23 years old. She wore a ceremonial dress of pale blue linen so thin it had no business existing in weather like this. The fabric pressed against her trembling frame like a second skin made of ice, and her feet, bare and reddening against the frozen ground, had long since passed the point of pain and arrived somewhere quieter, somewhere numb. She had not been given shoes. That had been a deliberate choice, and Mara Voss was smiling, not the crumbling smile of a woman trying to hold herself together, not the desperate grimace of someone pretending the world was not ending around them. It was something else entirely, something calm, something that lived behind her amber eyes like a candle burning in a room no one else had been invited into. It was the smile of a woman who already knew the ending of a story that everyone around her was still living through. Later, in the silence of his empty house, Theron Greymont would lie awake replaying that smile 10,000 times. He would turn it over in his mind the way a man turns a wound, probing for the edges of it, unable to stop, unable to understand. Of all the things he did to her that night, of all the careful cruelties he had engineered with the precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of making people feel small, it was the smile that undid him. But that comes later. This is the beginning. 9 years before the night in the snow, a girl of 14 arrived at the Iron Crest pack house with nothing but the clothes on her back and a bruise on her right temple the size of a fist. Her name was Mara Voss, and she was the last surviving member of a border village called Ashfin, which no longer existed. Rogues had come through 3 nights prior. They had not left much standing. The pack warrior who brought her in had already lost interest in her before he finished his report to the senior staff. She was thin, unremarkable, with dark hair that hung lank around a face that was too still for a child her age. No wolf of consequence, no bloodline worth noting, no family to negotiate on her behalf. She was assigned to the kitchens before sunset. What no one noticed, because no one was paying close enough attention to someone like Mara Voss, was that she arrived carrying something tucked against her chest beneath her torn coat. A small wooden wolf, carved from pale birchwood, smooth from handling. Her father had made it for her 7th birthday. She had kept it through 3 nights of running and hiding and not making a sound because sounds got people killed. She held it in both hands as a senior kitchen worker named Doss walked her through the servants' quarters, pointing out where she would sleep, where she would eat, what hours she would work. Doss spoke quickly and without cruelty, but also without warmth, the tone of someone delivering a contract rather than a welcome. Mara listened. She cataloged everything. The layout of the corridors, the way sound carried in the stone hallways, which doors stuck and which ones swung silent. She had always been good at noticing things. Back in Ashfin, her mother used to say that Mara had the eyes of someone twice her age, which had been a compliment then and would prove to be a survival skill now. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, wooden wolf pressed to her sternum, when an older kitchen worker walked past and plucked it from her hands with the casual ease of someone taking something that did not belong to her. "No toys in the kitchen," the woman said, and threw it into the cooking fire without breaking stride. Mara watched the birchwood catch, watched the careful lines her father's hands had carved curl and blacken and collapse into ash. She did not make a sound. She had learned 3 nights ago in the dark outside a burning village that sounds got people killed. She was still standing there when a boy came in looking for a snack and knocked her sideways trying to get to the bread shelf. He did not apologize. She picked herself up, straightened her coat, and went to find out where she was supposed to sleep. She did not cry until she was alone in the dark, curled on a straw pallet in the coldest corner of the servants' quarters, face buried in her arms so no one would hear. And when she was done, she lay very still for a long time, staring at the stone ceiling, and she made herself a quiet promise. She was going to survive this place. She was going to learn every single thing about it. And one day, when the time was right, she was going to walk out of here on her own terms. 9 years is a long time to be invisible. Mara learned the name of every crack in every floor she scrubbed. She learned that the eastern corridor had a loose stone 3 steps from the staircase landing, and that if you knew about it, you could step over it. But if you did not know, you would stumble, and the sound would echo. She learned which elders took bribes from the border traders, and which warriors had gambling debts large enough to make them desperate. She learned the secret passage behind the Great Hall fireplace that the previous Alpha's grandfather had built during the Northern Border Wars, and she learned where it came out, and she filed all of it away in the quiet, organized library of her mind. She also learned kindness, not from the wolves of Iron Crest, most of whom treated her as a piece of furniture that occasionally got in the way. She practiced it herself, deliberately, the way you exercise a muscle you're afraid might atrophy. Every day, she found one small way to offer something to someone weaker than herself, because she had decided very early on that the cruelty around her was not going to become the cruelty inside her. On a Thursday in late autumn, in the 9th year of her time at Iron Crest, a new child arrived. He was 8 years old, gap-toothed, with the wide, frightened eyes of someone who had recently learned that the world was not safe. A rogue attack on a border settlement. Same story as Mara's own arrival. A pack warrior had brought him in, already bored with the task before it was finished. Mara saw him standing outside the kitchen door, shoulders hunched against the cold, looking at the ground with the particular stillness of a child who had decided that if they did not move, the bad thing might not notice them. She did not have much. The kitchen staff received their meals as part of their compensation, 1 proper meal at midday and something lighter in the evening. She had just collected her evening portion, a bowl of thick stew and a heel of brown bread, and she had been carrying it toward the back corridor where the junior kitchen staff ate. She looked at the boy. She looked at her bowl. She sat down beside him on the cold stone step, and she held out the bread first. He looked at it for a long moment, then at her. She could see him calculating, the same calculation she had made at 14. "Is this a trap?" "It's just bread," she said. "I already ate the good part." She had not, but he did not need to know that. He took it, and she set the stew between them, and they ate together on the step in the fading autumn light, and she told him the name of the cook who was secretly kind, and the name of the one who was not, and which pallet in the servants' quarters was warmest, and that the loose stone in the eastern corridor was 3 steps from the landing, so step over it. She told him everything she wished someone had told her. She did not notice, from the far end of that corridor, that someone was watching. Theron Graymont, 29 years old, Alpha of Iron Crest, had come down to the lower level to retrieve a report that Holt had left in the wrong place. He was standing at the corridor junction, folder in hand, when he saw her. The kitchen girl. He had seen her 100 times without seeing her, the way you see wallpaper or flagstone, present but irrelevant, part of the texture of the place rather than a person in it. But something made him stop. He watched her divide her food without ceremony, watched her speak to the frightened child with the patient ease of someone who had been frightened themselves and had found their way through it. There was something in the quality of her stillness that caught at something in him, some frequency he could not name. Then one of his senior warriors called his name from the staircase above, and Theron Graymont tucked the folder under his arm and walked away. And by the time he reached the top of the stairs, he had already filed the moment in the category of things that did not matter. He was good at that. Filing things. The bond hit him like a lightning strike on a clear day. It was 6 months before the night in the snow. He was walking the lower corridor after a late council session, mind still running the numbers of the western border arrangement with Callista Verna's father, calculating troop positions and treaty language, when Mara came around the corner carrying a stack of ceramic serving dishes. Their eyes met. He felt his entire body reorient like a compass needle finding north. His wolf, that great silver-eyed creature that had been with him since his first shift at 16, surged forward with a sound that was less a growl and more a recognition. A word. A name it had always known. The air between them seemed to change temperature. The corridor seemed to narrow. He was aware of the exact distance between them in a way that had nothing to do with measurement and everything to do with need. She looked back at him with those amber eyes. For exactly 1 second, something passed between them. Something ancient and certain, and completely outside the language of choice. Then Theron Graymont extinguished it, not slowly, not reluctantly. With the same ruthless efficiency he applied to everything that threatened to complicate the architecture of his life. He looked away. He kept walking. By the time he reached the end of the corridor, the decision had already been made in the cold, clean room at the back of his mind, where he made all his important decisions. He had assessed the situation with the speed of someone who had been trained from birth to assess situations. A kitchen servant. No bloodline. No pack standing. No political value. No power. To stand before Iron Crest and present her as his destined mate would be to invite exactly the kind of contempt that he had spent 12 generations of careful cultivation trying to make impossible. His reputation, his alliances, the carefully constructed image of a perfect alpha ruling a powerful pack. She would ruin everything. He told himself this. He repeated it until it became the kind of truth you do not need to examine anymore. He repeated it even that same night, when he found himself standing outside the door of the servants' quarters, hand raised, not quite touching the wood, standing very still in the dark corridor for 3 long minutes, while his wolf threw itself against the walls of his will. Then he lowered his hand. He walked away. And by morning, the announcement of his formal courtship with Callista Verna of the Western Border Pack was posted on the notice board in the Great Hall. Mara read it on her way to the kitchen. She was carrying a cleaning cloth. She stopped, read the announcement once, and continued walking. She did not cry. She did not speak of it to anyone. She read it once, set it into the part of her mind where she kept things that were true and painful and not yet useful, and walked the rest of the way to the kitchen with the cleaning cloth still in her hand. There would be a time for all of it. There was not a time for it now. 3 days before the night in the snow, Mara woke before dawn with fire between her shoulder blades. It was not the dull ache of overwork or the sharp pull of a strained muscle. It was something else, something alive. She lay on her pallet with her cheek against the rough linen and breathed through it, cataloging the sensation the way she cataloged everything, and what she felt was heat, yes, but also a rhythm, a pulse, like something breathing in sync with her heartbeat in the exact center of her back. She got up while the corridor was still empty and made her way to Eldwin's quarters. The pack's senior healer was one of the few wolves in Iron Crest who had always treated her with something approaching respect. Not warmth exactly. More the professional courtesy of someone who saw patients as patients regardless of their standing. His door was unlocked. It was always unlocked. The copper mirror that hung on his wall was old and slightly warped, but clear enough. She turned her back to it, pulled her collar down, and looked over her shoulder. The mark covered her entire upper back. She stood very still for a long time, looking at it. A crescent moon, enormous, its curved arms cradling a wolf mid-howl, rendered in lines so fine and precise they looked carved rather than grown, silver that shifted like liquid starlight under her skin. It pulsed with each heartbeat. The lines were alive. She heard Eldwin's mortar hit the floor, heard the scatter of dried herbs across stone, heard the old man's breathing change. She turned around. He was pressed against his workbench with both hands gripping the edge, and he was staring at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 9 years. His eyes were wide. His hands were shaking. Eldwin, who had set bones and closed wounds and sat beside the dying without once showing anything more than professional focus, was shaking. She waited. He went to the shelf behind the false wall, the one she had known about for 7 years because she knew every false wall in this building, but had never touched because some things deserved their privacy. He pulled out a manuscript bound in pale leather, crumbling at the corners, and turned the pages with trembling fingers until he found what he was looking for. The page glowed faintly. Silver ink that had been set down 1,000 years ago and had not dimmed. He read aloud, his voice barely a breath. The crown of the moon goddess, bestowed once in 1,000 years upon the wolf she deems worthy to reshape the order of the packs. The bearer commands authority that no alpha can challenge, no council can overturn, and no rejection can sever. He looked up. His eyes were wet. "Child," he said, "do you understand what this means? You are not merely a Luna. You are the goddess's chosen sovereign. Every alpha on this continent answers to you." He paused. "Including Theron." Mara looked at the mark in the mirror for a long time. The wolf in the crescent moon seemed to turn its head, to look at her looking at it. She thought about 9 years. She thought about a wooden wolf burning in a cooking fire. She thought about scrubbing stone floors until her hands bled. She thought about the night in the corridor when Theron Greymont had looked at her, truly looked at her, and she had felt the bond flare between them like something being born, and she had seen the recognition in his eyes, the pull of it, unmistakable. and she had watched him snuff it out the way you snuff a candle. Deliberately, without ceremony. She thought about waking up the next morning to a notice on a board. She thought about 3 days from now, and a ceremony in the sacred grove, and a thin blue dress, and no shoes. "Do not tell anyone," she said. Eldwin blinked, but the mark alone would stop the ceremony. If Theron knew, he would recant. He would bring you furs, and call you his Luna, and parade you before the pack as if he had not spent 6 months treating you like you did not exist. "I know," Mara said. Her voice was quiet, completely steady. Something moved behind her amber eyes, deep and ancient, something that might have been older than either of them. "I don't want his recanting," she said. "I want him to choose freely. I want every wolf in that clearing to show me exactly who they are when they believe I have nothing. I need to see it clearly. All of it." Eldwin opened his mouth, closed it. He was old enough to recognize the particular quality of patience in her voice. He had heard it described in texts. The patience of the goddess herself, which was not the patience of someone waiting to be saved. It was the patience of someone who already knew what was coming and had chosen to let it arrive. He nodded slowly. He did not argue. And so, 3 days later, Mara Voss stood in the sacred grove of Iron Crest in a dress as thin as paper with her bare feet on frozen ground, and she listened to Theron Greymont's voice carry across the clearing like a war drum. She listened to him call her an orphan, a nobody, a mistake. She listened to Callista Verna's voice float from behind him, bright with victory. Perhaps someone should fetch her a blanket. She felt Barrick's handful of snow hit her feet, and she heard his voice bellow, and she heard the crowd roar with laughter. And through all of it, Mara Voss stood perfectly still, and she felt the mark burning on her back like a second sun, and she felt the mate bond writhing inside her like something wounded, screaming at her to fall, to break, to beg, and she breathed through it, one breath and then another. And she looked at the man who stood on the raised stone with his hand on another woman's back and his silver eyes bright with contempt. She looked at him, and she thought, "Remember this face. Remember exactly who you are when you think I have nothing." And she smiled. Callista saw it first. Something flickered in her expression, just for a moment, triumph interrupted, a candle blown sideways by a wind that had no business being there. She pressed closer to Theron's side and said, loudly enough for the first several rows to hear, that the rejection sickness was setting in, that it happened to the weak ones. Theron heard her. He looked at Mara one more time across the clearing. The smile was still there, unchanged, unbothered, and something about its steadiness moved through him like a current he could not name and did not stop to examine. He turned back to Callista. He raised his hand to signal the ceremony forward. Whatever the smile meant, it belonged to a story he had already finished writing. He descended from the stone dais and crossed the clearing with the easy confidence of a man who had never been genuinely denied anything, his boots crunching through the packed snow, his breath plumes of silver in the torchlight. He stopped before her. Up close, he could see the snowflakes caught in her eyelashes. He could see the strange calm in her amber eyes. Something moved in his chest, the bond making its last appeal. But he crushed it. "Any last words?" he said. He meant it to be ceremonial. He was not sure, even as he said it, whether it was also mocking. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. The wolves nearest them grinned. Mara looked up at him. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of that clearing with a clarity that seemed to make the bonfire lean toward her, as though even the flames understood that something significant was being said. "I accept your rejection, Theron Greymont," she said, freely and without protest. A murmur moved through the crowd. Rejected mates wept. They begged. They had to be carried away. None of them had ever simply accepted. "And I want you to remember this moment," she continued. She was still smiling. That quiet, knowing smile that had no business being on the face of someone standing barefoot in the snow while 300 wolves laughed at her. Remember the cold. Remember the laughter. Remember how certain you were. Remember the snow on my bare feet, and the dress you chose for me, and the way your pack threw ice at a girl who had done nothing to any of you except exist. She held his gaze. In the silence between her words and whatever came next, something passed between them. A tremor. A final pulse of the connection the goddess had made. Theron felt it move through him like a frequency he could not shut out, and for one fraction of one heartbeat, something crossed his face. Not recognition, not quite. More like the shadow of something he would spend the rest of his life trying to name. Then Mara Voss turned and walked barefoot through the parted crowd, through the flickering edge of the bonfire's light, and into the darkness of the forest. Her footprints glowed silver in the snow. No one noticed. They were too busy celebrating. Only Eldwin slipped away from the bonfire's warmth, moving quietly through the trees toward his hut, where he would spend the night writing letters. His hand shook as he wrote, not from age, from the weight of what he had witnessed. The goddess's chosen sovereign was walking into the wilderness, and when she returned, nothing would be the same. The forest received her without ceremony. There were no warm lights waiting between the trees, no shelter prepared, no one who had thought to leave a path. There was only the dark and the cold, and the snow that fell without opinion on everything it touched, and Mara Voss walking alone through all of it with bare feet and a dress that belonged to a different story. She should have been dying. That was the practical truth of it. The temperature had dropped well below what a human body could sustain without protection. And while her wolf gave her more resilience than an ordinary person, she was not shifted. She was not armored, and she had nothing between her skin and the winter except a layer of linen so thin it moved when she breathed. But the cold did not touch her. She noticed this after the first quarter mile, when she realized she had been expecting pain, and it had not arrived. The frozen ground beneath her feet felt firm rather than agonizing. The wind that had been tearing through the grove like something angry moved around her now, past her, through her hair but not against her skin. She stopped walking and stood very still between two ancient pines and held out her hand, palm up, and watched the snowflakes melt before they reached her. She turned her head and looked back the way she had come. Through the trees, the distant bonfire was still visible, a smear of orange light against the white dark. She could hear, faintly, the sounds of celebration, music, the deep percussion of boots on frozen ground. She faced forward again. The mark on her back pulsed once, steady as a heartbeat, warm as a held breath. It had been doing this since she began walking, a quiet directional warmth, slightly more intense in one direction than the others. Not insistent, not demanding, just present, the way a compass needle settles, not urgent, but certain. She followed it. Her footprints glowed in the snow behind her, tiny silver blooms that flowered briefly in each impression and then faded, like breath on glass. She did not look back at them again. There was only forward now, and the forest, and the quiet work of becoming whatever she was walking toward. She had 3 months of wilderness ahead of her. She intended to use every hour of it, somewhere behind her, in the servants' quarters of a pack house that would never feel the same again. A very old man sat at a small table by candlelight and began to write. Eldwin had been healer to Iron Crest for 41 years. In that time he had set broken bones, closed mortal wounds, talked people back from the edge of things they could not name. He had kept secrets that would have redrawn territorial maps if they had ever escaped his walls. He was not, by any measure, a man given to dramatic action. But his hand was shaking. He wrote 7 letters that night, 1 to each of the major pack healers and scholars he had known across the 7 territories, people who kept older knowledge than the official archives held, people who understood that the recorded history of the packs was a curated thing, shaped by the hands of those who had benefited most from a particular version of events. He did not name Mara in the letters. He did not need to. The people he was writing to would understand what the mark's reappearance meant without being told. He sealed each letter with plain wax and arranged for them to be carried out by dawn riders, and then he sat alone in his hut for the rest of the night with the ancient manuscript open on his table, reading passages he had memorized decades ago as though the words might have changed while he was not looking. They had not changed. They were exactly as uncompromising as they had always been. He thought about the look in Mara's amber eyes when she said, "Do not tell anyone." He thought about the quality of patience behind it. He had spent 60 years learning to read the internal weather of people in crisis, the way fear and grief and shock registered in posture and breath, and the particular tension around the eyes. He had looked for all of those things in her face. He had not found them. What he had found was something older, something that had been sitting quietly inside her for a very long time, waiting for the exact right moment to stand up. He closed the manuscript. He blew out the candle. In the dark, he pressed his forehead to his folded hands and said a quiet word to the goddess. Not a prayer exactly, more an acknowledgement. A recognition that whatever was unfolding was larger than his ability to manage or protect, and that this was, perhaps, as it should be. Then he went to his small bed and lay down, and did not sleep at all. The first territory Mara reached was Holofen, in the eastern valleys, on the 5th day of walking. She had eaten twice, both times from what she found in the forest. Winter roots and frozen berries that should have been inadequate for the distances she was covering. She was not hungry. She was not tired, not in the deep bone way she should have been. Her feet, which had bled briefly on the first night when she crossed a field of sharp, frozen bracken, had healed by morning. She was changing. She could feel it happening, gradual and certain, the way a season changes. Not dramatically, not all at once. But each morning she woke under the open sky feeling slightly more like someone she had not yet met. The border sentries of Holofen saw her coming from a long way off. She was not difficult to spot. A single figure moving across an open snowfield in a white cloak she had made from the lining of a fallen tree's bark shelter, her dark hair loose, her pace unhurried. They had their weapons raised before she was within shouting distance. She walked to within speaking range and stopped. "I need to see your alpha," she said. There were 4 of them, seasoned warriors, their breath fogging in the cold air. The largest one, a broad-shouldered woman with a scar that ran from her left ear to her jaw, looked Mara over with the flat assessment of someone who had spent decades deciding whether things were threats. "On what grounds?" she said. Mara reached back and drew her cloak aside at the shoulder, exposing the upper edge of the mark at the base of her neck. Even that small revealed portion was enough. The silver lines caught the winter light and threw it back changed, luminous, like something was alive under her skin. The scarred woman's hand dropped from her weapon. She did not give the order. Her arm simply lowered, the way a branch lowers under weight. Not a decision so much as a response to something her body understood before her mind caught up. The other 3 sentries shifted. One of them made a sound that was not quite a word. "Wait here," the scarred woman said, and her voice was different now. Not afraid. Careful. The way you are careful around something that could unmake your understanding of the world if you are not paying attention. Mara waited. Alpha Draven of Hollowfen was 58 years old, built like the mountains his pack had occupied for 6 generations, with one eye that had seen everything worth seeing, and one that had been lost in a border skirmish 20 years ago and had given him, in the years since, the habit of turning his whole head when he wanted to look at something carefully. He turned his whole head now. He had come out of his great hall with 4 senior warriors at his back, and the particular posture of a man who had been told something impossible and come to disprove it personally. He crossed the courtyard to where Mara stood waiting in the snow, his one eye moving from her face to her shoulder where the cloak was still drawn aside. He stopped 6 feet away. He looked at the mark for a long time, long enough that his senior warriors began exchanging glances, the subtle communication of people whose leader had never, in their memory, taken this long to respond to anything. Then Alpha Draven of Hollowfen, who had not knelt before anyone in 20 years, not the High Council, not the territorial governors, not the Alpha Gathering where kneeling was technically required by ceremonial protocol, and he had simply declined and dared anyone to comment, went to his knees in the snow, not slowly, not with the careful calculation of someone making a political gesture. His knees hit the ground with the solidity of something that had simply become true, the way a stone falls, because gravity does not negotiate. His 4 warriors stared. "I thought this was legend," Draven said. His voice was rough, worn down by decades of command to something that scraped rather than rang. He pressed his forehead toward the frozen ground, the deepest acknowledgement in wolf custom, the posture that said, "I recognize an authority older and greater than mine." "It was," Mara said. "Now it isn't." He raised his head and looked at her with that single eye, and what was in it was not the calculating deference of a political alliance or the reluctant submission of a man outmatched. It was something rawer than that. Something that lived in the oldest parts of what he was. He told her, that night over a fire in his great hall, about the last moon crowned, 1,000 years ago. A woman who had also been rejected, also cast out, also left alone in a winter that should have killed her. She had not survived it, not because the power had failed her, but because she had broken under the weight of what had been taken from her before she had learned to stand in what she had been given. She could not separate the wound from the gift, Draven said. His voice was careful, watching Mara's face as he said it. The rejection and the mark arrived together, and she could not hold both at once. The pain consumed the power before she understood what she was carrying. Mara looked into the fire for a long time. "How long did she last?" she asked. 11 days. She nodded. She turned this over in the quiet, organized room of her mind and looked at it from several angles. "The goddess doesn't choose the strongest," Draven said. "She never has. The texts are very clear about that, for anyone who reads them carefully enough." "What does she choose?" Mara asked, though she thought she knew. "The most patient." He paused. "The one who can be broken and choose, every single morning, to get up anyway." Mara was quiet for a moment. "I've been practicing that for 9 years, she said. Draven looked at her for a long time. Then something shifted in his expression. Grief, perhaps, or the old anger of someone who has watched injustice operate efficiently for long enough to know exactly how it sustains itself. "I know," he said. "I have people in most of the major pack houses. I have known about you for several years, Mara Voss. I knew about the rejection ceremony before it happened." He met her eyes. "I am sorry I did not act sooner." She considered this. "You didn't know what I was carrying," she said. "Neither did I." He offered her his war counsel that night, his intelligence networks, his resources, the full commitment of Holofen's 600 warriors and the 3 smaller packs that had sworn to his territory. Mara accepted all of it with the quiet gravity of someone who understood exactly what she was building and what it would cost, and why it mattered that it be built carefully rather than quickly. She stayed for 3 days. She met with his council. She walked through the settlement and the border villages attached to it, and she stopped and spoke to people that no visiting dignitary had ever stopped to speak to. The older women who ran the communal kitchens, the young healers who had been passed over for advancement because they did not have the right family names, the children who sorted herbs in the lower rooms of the healers' building, their small hands patient with the repetitive work. She learned their names, all of them. She asked each person she spoke to the same 2 questions. What do you need that you are not receiving? And what do you know that no one in power has bothered to ask you? The answers were specific and practical and filled with the compressed knowledge of people who had been managing impossible situations without adequate resources for so long. They had stopped expecting the situation to change. She wrote everything down. When she left on the 4th morning, there was a different quality to the silence she moved through. The sentries at the border did not just step aside. They bowed. The scarred woman who had first stopped her was among them. And when Mara passed, the woman reached out and briefly touched her own forehead in the old gesture of acknowledgement, the kind you made for something you could not quite put into language. Mara walked on. Behind her, Draven stood at the border stone and watched until she disappeared into the tree line, and then he went inside and began writing letters of his own. The second meeting was harder, not because the journey was longer, though it was. Not because the territory was more difficult, though Silver Ridge occupied the high mountain passes where the wind came sideways, and the cold had a different quality, denser, more intentional. It was harder because Sira was harder, and Mara had been expecting something difficult and still found herself reassessing. Sira had earned her title at 34 by defeating 11 challengers in formal combat, the last of whom had been her own brother. She had governed Silver Ridge for 9 years, with a reputation for military precision that the other alphas discussed with a specific combination of respect and wariness. She was not a woman who believed in things she could not test. She met Mara in an open training ground outside the main settlement, surrounded by 40 of her warriors and without any of the ceremonial framing that Draven had offered. She crossed her arms and looked at Mara the way you look at something someone is trying to sell you. "Show me," she said. Mara had been expecting this too. Sira unleashed her alpha command. There was no other way to describe it. The authority of a dominant alpha was not simply an aggressive posture or a raised voice. It was something that operated below consciousness. An animal transmission that bypassed the thinking brain and went directly to the older, deeper structures underneath. The part that understood hierarchy and survival and the cost of defying the dominant creature in the group. Siraz was among the strongest in the territories. Mara had heard it described by wolves who had felt it as a physical weight, a pressure on the chest, a compelling downward force. It washed over Mara like water over stone, not like she resisted it. Resistance implied effort, a push against a push. This was not resistance. The command simply did not apply to her, the way a river does not apply to the mountain it moves around. It found no purchase. It had nothing to grip. Sira's arms uncrossed. She took one step backward, which was the first involuntary step Mara suspected she had taken in years. And the expression on her face was something Mara recognized from Draven's courtyard. That particular rearrangement of a very certain person's features when certainty itself has been revised. "Your wolf," Sira said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was effortful now. "Show me your wolf." Mara shifted. She had done it once before, the night after she left Iron Crest, alone in a clearing, and even then the difference had shocked her. The small brown timber wolf that had been the source of so much ridicule and so many casually cruel comparisons was gone. What took its place moved through her like a tide coming in, enormous and inevitable, and when it finished arriving, she stood in the snow as a white wolf the size of a warhorse. The silver light was not separate from her fur. It moved with her, beneath her coat, pulsing in time with her breathing, like something captured and living, like trapped moonlight that had found a shape it was willing to inhabit. Her eyes were not amber anymore. They were gold, molten and deep, and when she raised her head and opened her throat, the sound that came out was not a howl in any conventional sense. It was a summons. It moved through the air and then through the ground and then through the mountains themselves, and 40 trained warriors who had been watching with professional composure found themselves on their knees in the snow, weapons still in their hands, unable to explain why their bodies had made this decision, only knowing that it had been correct, that this was the right response, that something inside them that was older than their names or their training or their pack allegiances had recognized what stood before them and acted accordingly. Sira's knees hit the ice. The crack was audible. She knelt with her hands on her thighs and her head inclined, and her expression had moved beyond surprise into something quieter and more permanent, the expression of a woman who had tested something and been given an answer she had not expected, and was already integrating the implications. When Mara shifted back, Sira rose from the snow. She was quiet for a long time. Around them, her warriors were getting back to their feet, with the slightly dazed coordination of people waking from a vivid dream. "You were rejected," Sira said. Not a question. She had received Draven's letter. "Yes." "And you didn't use the mark to stop it?" "No." Sira looked at her steadily. "Why?" Mara held her gaze. "Because I needed to know who they were when they thought I had nothing. I needed to see it clearly, without any uncertainty about what I was looking at. She paused. You can't build something real on a foundation you haven't tested. Syrah was quiet for another long moment. Then something shifted in her face, something that was not quite a smile, more the internal settling of a person who has found an alignment they had not known they were looking for. My warriors train here 6 days a week, she said, and every one of them was just put on their knees by a howl. She glanced sideways at one of them, a broad-shouldered man who was very deliberately not making eye contact with anyone. They'll be insufferable about it for months. A beat. I'll pledge Silver Ridge, and I want a seat at your war council. I'd expect nothing less, Mara said. Syrah looked at her. You're nothing like what I imagined. What did you imagine? Someone angrier. Mara was quiet for a moment. I was angry, she said, for a long time, but anger wants an audience. I decided I'd rather be effective. This time Syrah did smile, brief and genuine and slightly dangerous. Yes, she said, I think this is going to work. Pack by pack, through the deep throat of winter, Mara Voss built her alliance. She did not threaten. She did not perform. She arrived. She bore the mark. She answered questions honestly. And she allowed each alpha to make their own choice in their own time. Most chose quickly. The mark was not a matter of interpretation. It was the highest authority in wolf law, superseding bloodline and combat right, and every council decree that had ever been written. It left very little room for argument, but she did more than collect oaths of fealty. At each territory she visited, she stayed long enough to sit with the people who had been forgotten. The border villages whose needs never reached the Alpha's table because they had learned not to expect the table to care. The servants and kitchen workers who knew everything about the households they maintained and had never once been asked. The healers who had been managing impossible caseloads without adequate supplies for so long. They had developed a gallows humor about it. She sat with them. She listened. She asked the two questions every time. What do you need? And what do you know? She wrote everything down in a small notebook she had acquired at Holofen, and she read it every evening by whatever firelight she had available. And she began to understand the territories not as political entities with borders and troop numbers, but as living systems with pressures and failures and specific addressable points of pain. She thought about Theron sometimes in the evenings. She did not want to, but the bond, even severed, left traces, an ache in a specific register, an awareness of a direction. The way an amputated limb is said to still report sensation from the place where it used to be. She did not indulge it. She felt it, acknowledged it with the same honesty she brought to everything, and then she set it aside and returned to her notebook. She had work to do. She was building something real, something that would outlast the wound. In the 4th territory, a woman named Elsa, who ran the communal kitchens for a border settlement, looked up from her work when Mara sat down across from her, assessed the situation with the brisk clarity of someone who had been feeding 100 people a day for 30 years, and said, "You're the one they've been writing letters about." "Probably," Mara said. "You were a kitchen girl." "I was." Elsa looked at her steadily. "What are you now?" Mara thought about the mark warm on her back. She thought about Syrah's warriors on their knees in the snow. She thought about the notebook full of names and needs, and the specific geography of 100 different kinds of neglect. "I'm the person who's going to remember your name," Mara said, and make sure the system does too." Elsa looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached under the table and produced a loaf of fresh bread, still warm, and set it between them. "Eat," she said. "You look like you've been walking too long." Mara accepted the bread. She ate. They talked for 2 hours, and by the time she left, she had 4 pages of notes on the settlement's specific needs and Elsa's very precise, very practical suggestions for addressing them. And she had also, for the first time since the night in the snow, laughed at something. The sound surprised her. It came out rusty, slightly uncertain, like a door that had not been opened in a while. But it was real. She walked on through the winter. She had 3 months and 6 territories, and an alliance to build, and a world to reshape. She had been preparing for this her whole life. She just had not known it. Back in Iron Crest, in the great hall where the fire burned and the wine was always warm and the news arrived in a reliable trickle of reports, Theron Greymont received the first word of a wandering she-wolf claiming divine authority and laughed into his cup. The second report made him frown. The third report did not come by messenger. It came as silence. The Western Border Territory, Callista's father's land, sent no monthly tribute, no communication, no explanation. Theron dispatched Holt to investigate, and Holt returned 3 days later with a face that Theron did not immediately recognize as belonging to his beta, because Holt's face had never before arranged itself into precisely that configuration of poorly concealed alarm. 6 packs, Holt said, standing in front of the great hall fire with his massive frame casting a shadow that looked somehow smaller than it should. 6 packs had unified under a single sovereign. They called her the Moon-Crowned. He had seen the mark himself. He had stood in the same room with her, and his wolf had tried to kneel without his permission, and he had spent the entire meeting fighting his own body to remain upright, and he had not entirely succeeded because his knees had bent twice before he caught them. Theron stood from his throne. He kept his face arranged in the expression of a man in control of the situation. He had a great deal of practice at this. "Who is she?" he asked. Holt swallowed. "They say she came from here," he said. "They say she was rejected." The great hall went completely silent. Every wolf present, the elders in their chairs, the warriors along the walls, the servants frozen mid-task, went utterly still in the particular way of living things that have heard something that changes the shape of the room. And from the shadows at the edge of the firelight, Eldwin stepped forward. He had been there the whole time. No one had noticed him. He was good at that. He moved into the light with his gnarled staff and his aged face, and his eyes that were wet with something that was not grief exactly, more the weight of having been right about something you had desperately hoped to be wrong about. She carried the mark 3 days before the rejection ceremony, Eldwin said. His voice was quiet, and it filled the room anyway, the way certain kinds of truth fill rooms. I saw it with my own eyes. She asked me to say nothing. She wanted him to choose freely. He looked at Theron directly. "And you chose." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Theron Greymont had ever heard. He sat very still on his throne, while the implications arranged themselves in front of him with the pitiless precision of a mathematical proof. He had been given the goddess's chosen sovereign as his destined mate. He had known on some level that he had refused to examine that Mara Voss was not ordinary. He had felt the bond and recognized it and deliberately turned away from it. And then he had spent 6 months ensuring she was humiliated thoroughly enough that no one would question his rejection. And now she was standing at the head of 6 unified territories with an authority that superseded everything he had ever built. Because she had been poor. Because he had been ashamed. The full weight of his stupidity arrived not as a sudden blow, but as a slow, total pressure. The kind that has no outside edge, that presses in from every direction simultaneously. He could not find the angle to push back against it. There was no angle. It was everywhere. He slammed his fist on the arm of his throne. The crack echoed. "Prepare the warriors," he said. His voice came out exactly as he needed it to, flat and certain, and requiring no discussion. If she wants this territory, she will come and take it. Holt turned to carry out the order. The expression on his face as he turned away said everything he had decided not to put into words. In the corridor outside the great hall, Callista Verna had already gathered her traveling pack. She was gone before morning. The great hall of Iron Crest had never felt smaller. Theron Greymont sat alone in it for a long time after everyone had gone. The fire burned. The wine in his cup had gone cold. The announcement he had made still hung in the air like smoke that had not yet decided where to settle. And he sat in the middle of it with his hands on the arms of his throne and stared at the far wall and did something he had not done in a very long time. He thought. Not the kind of thinking he was practiced at. The tactical assessment of situations, the calculation of costs and advantages, the clean architectural work of strategy. This was different. This was the kind of thinking that arrived uninvited and sat down without asking, the kind that pulled open the dark closets of a man's interior and held up what it found there without apology. He thought about Mara Voss, not the sovereign, not the moon crowned with 6 packs at her back and the goddess's mark on her skin. He thought about the girl who had arrived at Iron Crest 9 years ago with nothing, and he made himself, for the first time, actually look at the memories he had spent years carefully not examining. He had been 20 years old when she arrived, already alpha in training, already fluent in the language of power and what it required of him. He had glanced at her for perhaps half a second when the intake report crossed his desk. Female, 14, border village orphan, no significant wolf. He had noted her existence the way you note a piece of furniture being moved into a room, registered and then dismissed. But there was one memory that would not stay in its cabinet. He had been walking the lower corridor late one evening, and he had come around a corner and stopped because of what he saw. A girl, 14 years old, standing very still in front of the cooking fire, watching something burn. Her face was entirely composed. Her hands were at her sides. Whatever was in the fire, she had already accepted that it was gone. He had stood there for a moment, watching her stillness, and he had felt something he could not name at the time, something adjacent to recognition. Then a senior warrior had called his name from the upper staircase, and he had turned and gone up, and he had filed the girl under irrelevant and had not taken her out of that file again for 6 years. He took her out of it now. He looked at that 14-year-old standing in front of the fire, and he understood for the first time what she had been watching burn, because Holt's intelligence reports had been thorough, and one of the details his network had assembled in the process of trying to understand who the moon-crowned was and where she had come from was a small piece of information so minor that the agent who included it had almost cut it for brevity. A wooden wolf. carved from birch, thrown into a kitchen fire on the day of her arrival by a senior kitchen worker named Doss, who had retired 3 years ago and was currently living on a modest pension in the southern settlement. Mara's only possession from her former life, gone within hours of her arrival, while she stood and watched and did not make a sound. Theron sat with this for a while. Then he pulled out the next memory. Mara at 16, carrying a tray of food into a council meeting. He remembered the meeting, a boundary dispute with the Eastern Territories, complicated and contentious, requiring his full attention. He remembered being irritated at the interruption when the door opened. He remembered the tray arriving. He did not, until this moment, remember what had happened next, because he had not been paying attention, because she had not been worth paying attention to. But the memory was there. He had simply never looked at it directly. Someone had extended a boot into the aisle as she passed, deliberately, casually. The tray had gone sideways. The sound of ceramic hitting stone had interrupted the meeting at a critical juncture, which had irritated him further. He had looked down at the girl on her hands and knees, collecting shattered pieces, and what he had felt, examining it now with the honest tools of a man who could no longer afford dishonesty, was not sympathy. It was annoyance. Annoyance that she existed in his line of sight. Annoyance that the council was looking at her instead of the map. Annoyance at the reminder of the parts of his territory he preferred to consider solved rather than ongoing. He had looked away. The meeting had resumed. She had cleared the debris and left. He had never thought about it again until now. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and held them there. He thought about the night 6 months ago in the lower corridor when the bond had arrived like a verdict, and his wolf had surged forward with a recognition so complete it had taken his breath away, and he had stood in the hallway with the certainty of a destined mate moving through him like sunlight through a clean window, filling every corner, and he had turned it off, deliberately, efficiently. The way you make a decision before the competing argument can get fully organized. He thought about standing outside her door that night. 3 minutes in the dark with his hand raised and the bond pulling at him like a tide, and his wolf making sounds he had never heard it make before. He thought about the exact quality of the silence in that corridor. The way the stone floor had been cold under his feet. The faint smell of herbs from Eldwin's end of the hallway. He thought about walking away, and then, because he had apparently decided tonight was the night for the full inventory, he thought about the rejection ceremony. He had designed it. That was the truth he had been most careful to keep in the furthest, darkest cabinet of all. Not the ceremony itself, that had been within his rights as Alpha. Rejection was legal, even if rare. But the architecture of the humiliation. The dress he had specifically requested the thinnest ceremonial fabric available. The shoes he had told the ceremony coordinator that footwear was not appropriate for the ritual. A custom he had invented on the spot, and that no one had questioned because no one questioned him. Callista's placement at his side, the precise positioning of his hand on her back, calculated to be visible from every angle of the clearing. The choice of the sacred grove, the largest ceremonial space, capable of accommodating the full pack. He had wanted it to be complete. He had wanted there to be no version of that night that Mara Voss could reframe into something survivable. He had wanted to ensure, with the thoroughness he brought to everything, that she would never be able to pretend that some part of Iron Crest had been on her side. He had been very thorough. He sat with this for a long time, long enough that the fire burned down to coals, and the hall grew cold around him, and he did not move to add wood, because the cold felt appropriate. It felt like the first honest thing the room had offered him in years. He did not know, sitting there in the darkening hall, that 3 months away across the winter territories, a young woman was sitting by a fire of her own with a notebook full of names, learning the specific texture of everyone else's pain and writing it down so she would not forget a single detail. He did not know that she was building something real and permanent and designed to outlast the wound. He did not know any of this. What he knew was that he had been given something extraordinary and had thrown it away because it arrived in a form that his pride had decided was beneath him. The full dimension of his stupidity settled onto his chest like stone. He did not sleep. In the morning, Holt brought the War Council report. 800 combat-ready warriors, full winter armor, adequate provisions for a sustained territorial defense. On paper, a formidable force, the accumulated military strength of 12 generations of Greymont rule, the product of careful cultivation and strategic thinking, and the particular kind of institutional excellence that comes from never having been seriously threatened. Holt laid it out with his characteristic precision, maps and numbers and logistical assessments, and when he was finished, he folded his hands on the table and waited with the patience of someone who had something more to say and was selecting the right moment. Theron looked at the numbers. 4,000 wolves at her back, 6 unified territories, and a mark that had not been seen in 1,000 years, that superseded every law and custom and inherited authority that Iron Crest had ever operated under. "Say it," Theron said. Holt was quiet for a moment. "My wolf tried to kneel," he said. "I was standing in a room with her, conducting an intelligence assessment, maintaining professional distance, and my wolf tried to kneel without my consent." He met Theron's eyes. "I have never lost control of my wolf. Not once. Not in 30 years of service." A pause. "I held out for about 40 seconds before I caught it. Some of my team were not as quick." Theron said nothing. "The mark is real," Holt said. "Not a performance, not a manipulation. The old laws are unambiguous. I have read them myself, the original texts, not the summaries. She holds authority that supersedes pack leadership, territorial claim, and council decree." Another pause. "Including yours." "I know what the old laws say," Theron said. "Then you know what this is," Holt said. And his voice, which had spent 30 years being carefully neutral on everything, held something now that was almost grief. "This is not a battle, Theron. A battle requires 2 comparable forces. This is something else." The silence that followed had the quality of a room after an irreversible decision. Theron looked at the maps on the table, the clean lines of territorial borders, the careful notation of strategic positions, the accumulated work of a life spent building something he had believed in. He thought about Mara standing barefoot in the snow with that smile on her face. He thought about what she had known that he had not. "Leave me," he said. Holt left without argument, which was itself a kind of answer. Theron sat alone with the maps and the cold morning light coming through the narrow windows, and the weight of what was coming pressing down with the patient certainty of something that had always been going to arrive. He could not stop it. He had understood this since Holt's report, perhaps since the moment in the great hall the night before, when Eldwin had stepped into the firelight and said the words she wanted you to choose freely. She had known. She had stood in the snow with the mark burning on her back and the goddess's authority at her disposal, and she had let him humiliate her in front of every wolf in the territory, because she had needed him to show himself completely, without the mitigation that power provides, without the safety net of consequence. She had given him the rope. He had used it with considerable thoroughness. Outside the windows, the winter continued its work. The snow fell without opinion. The wolves of Iron Crest went about their morning routines with the slightly elevated tension of a pack that had received difficult news and was waiting to understand what it meant. Someone in the lower courtyard was sharpening a blade, the regular rhythmic sound of it carrying up through the cold air. Theron pressed his fingers flat against the map of his territory and looked at the familiar shape of it. The mountain ranges and river systems, the border stones placed by his grandfather's grandfather, the settlements that bore names older than the written records. He thought about 12 generations. He thought about a 14-year-old girl watching a wooden wolf burn. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he began, with a systematic thoroughness that was perhaps the only consistent virtue his pride had not managed to contaminate, to understand exactly what he had done, not to excuse it, not to find the angle that made it more defensible, simply to see it, clearly and completely, the way you look at a wound before you decide whether it can be treated. It could not be treated. He understood this before the morning was finished. What had been done to Mara Voss in the sacred grove of Iron Crest, and in the 9 years before it, was not a mistake that could be apologized into a smaller shape. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a failure of information or judgment or circumstance. It had been a series of deliberate choices made by a man who had possessed all the relevant information and had chosen his pride over every other consideration available to him. He had been the Alpha of Iron Crest. He had been responsible for every wolf in this territory. She had been one of those wolves. He had failed her in every way it was possible to fail someone. He sat with this. He did not look away from it. He gave it the full, unmitigated attention it deserved. It took most of the morning. When Holt returned at midday to ask for confirmation of the defensive positions, Theron gave the confirmation in the expected language of a man who had made his decision and would see it through. His voice was steady. His face was composed. He was very good at this. But something had shifted in the architecture of him, quietly and permanently, the way a foundation shifts in a heavy frost, something that could not be shifted back. That night, the night before the full moon, Theron walked out of the pack house alone and stood in the courtyard in the dark and breathed the winter air and felt, for just a moment, moving through the cold, like a ghost of something he had murdered, the scent of winter jasmine and moonlight. Her scent, the Bond's last breath. His wolf, which had been lying very still and very quiet in the deep interior of him for 3 months, made a sound that had no word in any language he knew, low and terrible and completely without hope. He stood in the snow for a long time. Then he went inside and closed the door and prepared, with the thoroughness that was all he had left, for what was coming. The full moon rose over Iron Crest, like a judgment. It came up slowly behind the eastern ridge, enormous and white and completely without mercy, the kind of moon that made the snow glow from within, that turned the world into a study in silver and shadow, that removed the comfortable ambiguity of partial light and replaced it with a clarity so total it felt almost aggressive. Every surface it touched was illuminated. Every shadow it cast was precise. It was not the kind of night that permitted pretending. Mara had timed this deliberately. She arrived at the boundary stones of Iron Crest at the exact moment the moon cleared the ridge, and the timing was not theatrical. It was functional. The mark on her back responded to the full moon the way a fire responds to wind. Brighter, more certain, more completely itself. She wanted every wolf on both sides of that boundary to see it. She wanted there to be no version of this night that anyone could misremember. Behind her, 4,000 wolves stood in formation across the snowfields. Their collective breath rose in a single cloud that obscured the lower stars. They had moved through the night in near silence, the kind of disciplined quiet that belongs to people who understand the weight of what they are part of. Draven's warriors anchored the left flank, 600 strong, their one-eyed alpha at the head of them with the stillness of a man who had been waiting a long time for this particular morning. Sira's fighters ran the right flank in wolf form, a river of gray and silver pouring across the snow. Sira herself at their head, the scars on her muzzle silver in the moonlight, her eyes holding the focused calm of someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Mara walked at the front of all of it. She wore a white cloak, simple wool, no ornamentation except the silver circlet on her brow. The circlet had been forged by the smiths of Hollowfen from metal that had fallen from the sky, and it was not heavy, but it had a presence, the way certain objects do when they have been made with complete intentionality. Her feet were bare, not because she lacked for boots, because she had stood barefoot in this territory's snow before, and she wanted the symmetry to be visible to everyone who remembered that night. The snow melted in a perfect circle with each step she took. Frost blossoms opened and faded in her wake, tiny and white, there and gone. She raised her hand at the boundary stones. 4,000 wolves stopped as one. The silence that followed was the kind that has mass. On the other side of the boundary, Iron Crest's forces were arrayed in full winter formation. 800 warriors in dark armor, their breath fogging, their weapons held with the particular rigidity of people who had been told to project confidence, and were working very hard at it. Many of them had been training together for years. Some had family in the ranks across from them. The faces Mara could see in the front lines were doing the specific work of remaining neutral, while their eyes performed calculations that their expressions were not permitted to show. Theron stood at the front. He wore his black wolf fur cloak, the one that had always made him look like something carved rather than born, all clean lines and contained power. His silver eyes were burning. His jaw was set. He had not slept in 3 days, and the bond's ghost had been with him for every hour of it, not the bond itself, that had been severed by his own words, but the echo of it, the phantom limb that reported sensation from where something used to be. He looked, to anyone watching carefully, like a man who had made his decision and intended to see it through and was not going to allow himself to think about whether the decision was right, because thinking about that now served no function. Callista was not there. The space where she might have stood was simply empty. Mara looked across the 30 feet of snow between them, in the moonlight, with 4,000 wolves behind her, and the mark burning through her cloak in visible silver pulses. She was not the girl who had scrubbed his floors. She was also not that girl. She was both things simultaneously, and the simultaneity of it was perhaps the most destabilizing thing about her, that she carried her entire history without apology. that the 9 years of invisibility and the goddess's mark occupied the same body with complete equanimity. She looked at him for a long moment. "You can still kneel," she said. Her voice was quiet. It carried anyway, through the cold air and across the snow and into the ears of 800 Iron Crest warriors who had been told this was a battle, and were beginning to understand that it was not. There does not need to be blood. This does not need to be the story that gets told about Iron Crest. You can make a different choice right now. Theron's jaw tightened. "I am the Alpha of the 12th generation of Greymont rule. My line has held this territory through 5 border wars, 3 succession crises, and a plague that killed a third of the northern packs." His voice was steady, controlled. "I will not kneel to a servant girl." Mara nodded once, not in agreement, in the manner of someone who has heard an expected answer and is proceeding accordingly. "I was a servant girl," she said. "I scrubbed your floors. I served your meals. I mended your warriors' clothing and endured the contempt of your entire pack for 9 years without once giving you a reason to treat me the way you treated me." She tilted her head slightly. "I also learned every corridor in your stronghold, every weakness in your walls, every secret passage your grandfather's grandfather built during the Northern Border Wars. I know which of your warriors have debts that make them vulnerable, and which of your elders have been taking payments from the border traders for favorable tariff decisions." She paused. "Let that settle." "I was beneath your notice," she said. "That was your first mistake. People talk freely around those they consider invisible." A ripple moved through Iron Crest's front line. Not movement exactly. More like the collective internal adjustment of people who are recalculating. Theron said nothing. The vein at his temple was visible from 30 feet away. "Your rejection was not your greatest error," Mara continued. Her voice had not changed. It remained exactly what it had been throughout. Quiet, precise, carrying the flat accuracy of a woman stating documented facts. "Your greatest error was cruelty. You did not simply exercise your right as Alpha. You designed a performance. You requested the thinnest dress available. You told the ceremony coordinator that footwear was inappropriate for the ritual, a custom you invented specifically for that night." She held his gaze. "You positioned Callista precisely where she would be most visible. You chose the sacred grove because it holds the most witnesses. You made it a spectacle because you wanted to ensure that no part of what was done to me could be walked back or minimized or forgotten. The silence was absolute. You wanted to break me completely," she said. "You wanted to make certain I had nothing left when I walked out of that clearing." The gentleness in her voice was more devastating than anger would have been. "Do you remember what I said to you?" Theron's hands were fists at his sides. His wolf was making sounds he could feel but not hear. He said nothing. "I said, remember this moment," Mara said. "I meant it." She stepped forward across the boundary stones. The front line of Iron Crest warriors raised their weapons. Reflex. Training. The muscle memory of 800 people who had been told their job was to hold a line. The mark came through her cloak like a door opening. It was not subtle. It was not the restrained pulse it maintained in ordinary moments. It was the full expression of what it was, silver light pouring through the white wool like sunlight through thin cloth. Except sunlight did not feel like this, did not carry this specific quality of recognition. this frequency that bypassed every layer of learned behavior and spoke directly to the oldest, deepest thing inside every wolf present. The compulsion moved through Ironcrest's front line like a wave. It was not pain. That was the thing about it that no one had been prepared for. They had been braced for force, for something to fight against, for the physical resistance of one power meeting another. What arrived instead was clarity, recognition, the oldest instinct in wolfkind, the one that existed before packs and territories and alphas and all the architecture of hierarchy that wolves had built over millennia, the one that said this, here, this is what all of that was pointing toward. Weapons dropped, warriors went to their knees, row by row, like something rehearsed, except nothing had prepared any of them for this. Many of them were weeping, not from pain or fear, but from the overwhelming, disorienting experience of a certainty so complete it left no room for anything else. Some of them pressed their foreheads to the frozen ground. Some simply knelt with their faces turned upward, like people standing in rain after a long drought. Within 3 minutes, only one wolf in Ironcrest's formation remained standing. Theron Greymont stood alone in a field of kneeling warriors, and the expression on his face was the most human thing Mara had ever seen on it. He was fighting. She could see the full dimension of it from where she stood. The sweat on his face despite the freezing air. The blood from his nose that had begun in the first 30 seconds and was now tracking in a thin line down his upper lip. The audible sound of his breath, hard and deliberate. A man doing the work of remaining upright through pure will when everything inside him was pulling in another direction. His wolf was throwing itself against his stubbornness with everything it had. She could see it in the micro tremors moving through his frame, the way his knees bent slightly and then locked again, bent and locked. A conversation happening in real time between the animal and the man, and the pride that had governed both of them for so long it had become indistinguishable from identity. Mara walked toward him. She stopped 6 feet away. Up close, she could see the full cost of it. The blood from his ears now as well. Thin threads of it, bright against his skin. The cord standing out in his neck. His hands, clenched so hard the knuckles had gone white and then past white to something that looked structural, load-bearing, the last physical expression of a will that was rapidly running out of material. "Kneel," she said softly. Not a command, not a performance. The word of someone offering an end to something that did not need to continue. He held. 10 seconds. 20. His spine bowed under something invisible and enormous. His shoulders shook. His breath came in controlled bursts that were losing their control at the edges. On the 30th second, Theron Greymont's knees buckled. He went down hard, both palms hitting the frozen ground, head dropping forward. The sound he made was not a growl. It was not a snarl. It was a broken exhale, the specific sound of a man releasing something he had been holding for so long he had forgotten it was not a permanent part of his structure. The silence that followed belonged to the snow and the moon and 4,000 wolves who were not breathing. Mara looked down at the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, kneeling in the same snow where she had once stood barefoot and been laughed at. "I accept your submission," she said. Then she turned and walked back toward the boundary stones to begin the work she had actually come here to do. The conquest of Ironcrest was bloodless. This was not an accident. Mara had designed it that way with the same deliberate precision that Theron had once applied to her humiliation. She had understood in the 3 months of walking and listening and building that the point was never to destroy Iron Crest. The point was to correct it. There was a significant difference, and the difference mattered to everyone who would have to live in the territory after tonight. She established her working court in the Great Hall by mid-morning. She did not remove Theron's throne. She had it moved to the side of the room, where it sat against the wall like a piece of furniture that had belonged to a previous occupant and had not yet been disposed of. A long oak table was brought in and positioned at the center, and around it she placed chairs for the alphas who had pledged to her, and for Holt, who had been named acting alpha of Iron Crest pending formal installation, and for Eldwin, who had earned his place at any table she would ever preside over. The first order of business was not dramatic. It was administrative. She went through the territory's records with Eldwin and Holt and began the specific, unglamorous work of identifying every structural inequity that had been built into Iron Crest's operations and replacing it with something functional. The first formal decisions came in the afternoon. The 5 senior elders who had not only approved the rejection ceremony but had actively encouraged its theatrical elaboration were brought before the table. They came in with the posture of men who had spent decades being deferred to and had not yet fully registered that this was no longer the operating condition. The eldest of them, a hawk-faced man named Corvath, had already prepared a speech. Mara let him finish it. She listened with complete attention, which seemed to unsettle him more than interruption would have. When he was done, she said, "You will each be reassigned to the border villages, the specific villages that have been most underserved by Iron Crest's resource distribution over the past decade. You will perform the work of those communities, the maintenance, the supply management, the direct service, for a period of no less than 2 years. You will not hold advisory roles. You will not supervise others. You will do the work itself." Corvath's expression arranged itself into outrage. "This is degrading," he said. "We are senior members of this pack's governing body. We have served Iron Crest for decades." Mara looked at him. "I know it's degrading," she said. "I did it for 9 years." The room was very quiet. Corvath opened his mouth. Something in her face, the complete absence of cruelty in it, the simple, factual steadiness of someone who was not angry, but was also absolutely not going to be moved, closed it again. They were escorted out. The warriors who had been loudest in the sacred grove that night came next. Mara had a very good memory for faces and voices, and she had spent considerable effort in the 3 months since that night ensuring she could account for each of the ones she was thinking of. They were reassigned to Syrah's training camps, a prospect that produced a specific quality of apprehension in people who had heard about Syrah's training camps. None of them were harmed. All of them would be significantly humbled, which was not the same thing, but served the same necessary function. Barek, the warrior who had thrown snow at her bare feet, was given the camp's sanitation detail. When he understood what this meant, he looked at her with an expression that had moved past indignation into something more complicated. "For how long?" he asked. "Until Syrah thinks you're ready for something else," Mara said. "I'd suggest making a genuine effort." He was escorted out. Then they brought in Callista Verna. She had been found in the border settlement she had fled to 3 days after leaving Iron Crest. By the time they brought her to the Great Hall, she had been in transit for 2 days. And the Callista Verne, who walked through the doors of the hall where she had once stood at Theron's side and rehearsed the language of her acceptance speech, was almost unrecognizable. The beauty was still there, Technically, the bone structure, the auburn hair, the height. But fear and sleeplessness had done what confidence had once concealed, revealing the actual architecture underneath. And what Mara saw in her face as she came to stand before the table was something she had not expected and had to be careful with. She saw someone very young who had made a series of choices she had not fully understood the weight of. This did not absolve her. Mara was clear on that. What Callista had contributed to the specific texture of those 9 years, and in particular to that night, had been real and deliberate. The salt in the food, the loosened stitching in the sleeping palette, the careful selection of the thinnest dress. These had been her initiatives, not Theron's, expressions of a particular kind of cruelty that operated through small degradations because it understood that small degradations, accumulated over time, were more difficult to survive than single large ones. But Mara had spent 3 months listening to people describe the systems that had shaped them, and she understood, without excusing, that Callista had also been inside a system, one that had told her, consistently and from a young age, that her value was contingent on her position, that position was contingent on alliances, and that anyone who threatened those alliances was a threat to her survival. She was not going to pretend that this explained everything, but it explained something. "Sit down," Mara said, and gestured to the chair across from her. Callista sat. Her hands were folded in her lap with the rigid precision of someone controlling a tremor. "You were a tool," Mara said. "Theron used your father's alliance the way a carpenter uses a hammer. That is true, and I don't hold it against the hammer." She paused. "But you were also cruel in ways that were entirely your own, not his direction. Yours." Callista looked at the table. "The dress," Mara said, "the palette stitching, the salt, the specific arrangement of small humiliations that you contributed to my daily life over the course of several years." She kept her voice even. "Those were not Theron's ideas. I know this because I know how he thinks, and that level of sustained personal attention was not in his repertoire. That was yours." Callista's mouth opened. Something in Mara's face closed it again. "You will serve in Eldwin's healing practice for 2 years, Mara said. "You will learn the work of tending wounds rather than inflicting them. After that period, you are free to rebuild your life in whichever territory is willing to have you." Callista stared at her. The expression on her face was moving through several stages: disbelief, then the beginning of a rebuttal, then something that looked like it might become relief before it settled into something more complex and permanent. "That's all?" she said, and her voice was very small. "That's all," Mara said, "unless you'd prefer something harsher, in which case I can certainly accommodate that preference." Callista looked at the table for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. Not with gratitude exactly. With something harder to name. The specific disorientation of someone who had prepared for one kind of encounter and received something they had no category for. "Why?" she said. Mara looked at her steadily. "Because rage is loud and justice is quiet," she said. "And I've spent 9 years learning the difference." Callista was escorted out. The hall was briefly empty except for Mara and Eldwin and Holt, who had been present for all of it with the focused attention of people bearing witness to something they understood they would be describing for the rest of their lives. Eldwin poured 3 cups of water from the pitcher on the table and set one in front of Mara without comment. She accepted it. She drank. For a moment, in the relative quiet, She was just a 23-year-old woman who had been walking for 3 months and had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in longer than she could precisely calculate. Then Holt said quietly, "There is one more." She set down the cup. "I know," she said. Theron was brought in without guards. This had been her instruction. No escort, no ceremonial framing, no audience except Holt, who stood by the door with the expressionless reliability of a man who had decided that his job was to be a fair witness to whatever happened next, and Eldwin, who remained in his chair with his hands folded and his old eyes steady. Theron walked in with the posture of a man who had decided something. He was not in his black wolf fur cloak. He had changed into plain clothing, dark wool without ornamentation, and the effect was disorienting in the specific way that removing a uniform is disorienting when the uniform has been the primary thing you have been responding to. Without the apparatus of the Alpha, he looked younger, also considerably more tired. He stopped in front of the table. Mara looked at him. She had been preparing herself for this, in the abstract, for 3 months. She had known it was coming. She had organized her thoughts about it with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything, sorted through what she felt and what she intended, and what she was willing to do and what she was not, and had arrived at a position she was confident in. She was still not entirely prepared for the actual experience of looking at him across a table in a room where no one was performing for anyone. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He folded his hands on the table in the manner of someone who has decided to be exactly what they are without additional construction. "Your title as Alpha of Iron Crest is revoked," Mara said. "Holt will be formally installed at the end of this week, pending confirmation from the territory's senior warriors, which Holt informs me is effectively already secured." She paused. "You will not be exiled. You will not be imprisoned. You will be housed in the settlement in a modest residence with adequate provisions. You are free to live your life without restriction." Theron said nothing. "You will hold no authority, no advisory role, no formal standing within the pack structure." She kept her voice level. "I expect you understand what this means in practice." "Yes," he said. His voice was even. It had the quality of something that had been stripped down to its essential frequency. "It means I'll be nothing. It means you'll be a person," she said, "without the architecture of the title around you. That may feel like nothing for a while." He was quiet for a moment. The hall was very still. "That's it?" he said, not challenging, genuinely asking. "That's it," she said. He looked at the table. Something moved across his face that was too complicated and too private to name from the outside. His hands shifted slightly on the table surface, a small involuntary movement. Then he stood. He moved around the table, and he stopped in front of her, and he did something that no one in the room had instructed or anticipated or would have predicted from a man of his history. He went to his knees. Not the compelled submission of the morning, the body overriding the will under the weight of the mark's authority. This was different, and everyone in the room could feel the difference immediately. This was entirely voluntary. Every part of him that was still capable of choosing was choosing this. He looked up at her from the floor with his silver eyes, and what was in them had no name in the language of power and hierarchy that had been the only language he had spoken for his entire life. It was something rawer than that, something that lived on the far side of pride, in the territory that pride had been preventing him from reaching for 29 years. I don't ask for forgiveness, he said. His voice was quiet. I know what I did. I know what I chose and what I didn't choose, and I understand clearly that those aren't things that forgiveness resolves. He held her gaze. I want you to know that I see it. All of it. The wooden wolf, the palette stitching, the dress. His jaw tightened briefly. The door I didn't knock on. The room was absolutely silent. I want you to know, he said, that I see you. Finally. Fully. Whatever that's worth now. Mara looked at him for a long time. The Bond's ghost moved through her, that familiar ache in a specific register, the phantom sensation of something that had existed and been severed and had left its shape behind in the absence. She felt it. She did not look away from it. She let it be exactly what it was. Then she said, "Stand up, Theron." He stood. She looked at him steadily. What you've said doesn't change the decisions. It doesn't restore what was taken. She paused. But I heard it, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't. He nodded once. Something in his shoulders changed. A fractional release of a tension that had probably been there so long it had felt like posture. He turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. He did not turn around. "Why did you keep flowers on the children's graves?" he said. "The orphans. Every month, fresh flowers on their parents' graves in the lower settlement. No one knew it was you. Holt only found out 6 months in." The room was quiet. "Because someone should," Mara said. He stood in the doorway for one more moment. Then he walked through it, and the door closed behind him, and Mara sat in the great hall of Iron Crest with her hands flat on the oak table, and the moonlight coming through the high windows in long silver bars, and the mark warm and steady on her back, pulsing with the rhythm of something that had always been exactly what it was. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The moon was still up. Across the snowfields, 4,000 wolves who had come here prepared for a battle they had not needed to fight were making camp with the particular quiet of people who were still processing what they had been part of. Fires were being built. Provisions were being distributed. Sierra's warriors had shifted back to human form and were moving through the camp with the brisk competence of people who had trained for every contingency and were grateful that the contingency tonight had not required the ones involving weapons. Draven appeared in the doorway of the great hall. He looked at Mara across the room. His one eye held a warmth that had not been there the first morning she arrived at his border, something that had grown in the weeks since, the particular regard of someone who had been shown something they had been waiting a long time to see. "How are you?" he asked. It was a simple question, not political, not strategic, just a person asking another person how they were, the kind of question that sometimes arrives at the exact moment when its simplicity is the most necessary possible thing. Mara thought about it honestly. "Tired," she said, "and not done." Draven nodded. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her, and he poured himself a cup of water from Eldwin's pitcher, and he said nothing further because there was nothing further that needed saying. Outside, the moon moved across its arc. Iron Crest was quiet. The work was just beginning. Spring came to the 7 territories the way it always came to the high mountain country. Not all at once, not with any particular drama, but in small persistent increments that accumulated until one morning you looked out at a hillside and understood that something had changed while you were paying attention to other things. The snow retreated from the southern slopes first. then the lower valleys. Then, slowly and with visible reluctance, from the upper ridges where it had been sitting since October, releasing its grip on the stone in thin rivulets that found their way downhill and joined other rivulets and eventually became the spring runoff that the border villages depended on for their planting. Mara watched it from the window of the Iron Crest Great Hall on a morning in late March and thought about water, about the way it found the path of least resistance, not because it was weak, but because it understood that persistence over time accomplished what force alone could not. She had been governing for 4 months. It did not look the way she had imagined governing would look in the abstract, back in the days when imagining it had been a way of surviving the present. It was less ceremonial than that, more granular. The actual work of reshaping 7 territories was largely administrative, a continuous stream of specific decisions about specific problems, each one requiring attention and information and the willingness to sit with complexity, rather than resolve it prematurely into something simpler. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. She had spent 9 years developing the particular skill of understanding systems from the inside, the view from the kitchen and the servants' quarters, and the places where the official version of how things worked collided with the actual version, and that view turned out to be exactly what was needed for the work of making things function differently. The council met every morning at the long oak table. It included representatives from every territory, and within each territory, representatives from every level of the community. The border village delegates had been the most difficult to integrate, not because they were difficult people, but because they had spent so long outside the frame of consideration that many of them arrived at their first council session with the specific uncertainty of someone who has been told the rules have changed and is not yet confident that they will not change back. Mara made a point of addressing this directly and early. In the second week of council sessions, a woman named Petra, who represented 3 border settlements in the eastern valleys, sat through an entire morning of discussion without speaking. She was clearly listening, clearly engaged, clearly had opinions about at least 4 of the items under discussion. She simply did not speak. At the end of the session, Mara asked her to stay. They sat together at the long table after everyone else had gone, and Mara said, "You had thoughts on the supply distribution proposal. I could see it." Petra looked at her hands. "I didn't want to overstep." "You have a seat at this table," Mara said. "The seat is not decorative." Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "In my experience, when people who don't usually have seats at tables are given them, the seats are often there to create the appearance of inclusion rather than the practice of it." Mara nodded. "That's a fair assessment of how it usually works." "Is it different here?" Mara looked at her steadily. "The supply distribution proposal as currently written has 3 structural problems that will make it actively harmful to border settlements in the second year of implementation, and you know what they are because you live in a border settlement and I do not." She paused. "So I need you to tell me, not because your voice is decorative, because I will get this wrong without the information you have." Petra told her. She was right about all 3 problems. The proposal was revised. This pattern repeated itself across the months in ways both large and small. The gradual calibration of a system that was trying to learn how to hear the people it had previously only processed. It was not seamless. There were errors, moments when the old structures reasserted themselves and the habits of people who had operated within them for so long they no longer noticed the habits. There were council members who defaulted to addressing Mara and ignoring the border delegates. There were warriors who extended professional courtesy to other warriors and something more qualified to the healers and kitchen workers who shared their table. Mara addressed each instance directly, without drama, with the flat precision of someone correcting a measurement rather than punishing a person. The corrections accumulated. The system, slowly and imperfectly, began to change. The elders she had reassigned to the border villages sent a formal complaint in the 6th week. It was written in the elaborate language of official grievance, full of references to precedent and the dignity of their former positions and the unprecedented nature of the punishment and the damage being done to the institutional knowledge that only they possessed. Corvath had clearly drafted most of it. His particular combination of rhetorical flourish and poorly concealed outrage was recognizable even through the formal register. Mara read the complaint in full. She set it aside. She wrote back a single paragraph. She acknowledged receipt of the complaint. She noted that the work they were performing was the same work that had been performed by wolves in those settlements for generations, wolves who had not complained about its dignity because they had not been given the infrastructure of complaint. She expressed confidence in their ability to adapt. She did not alter the terms of their reassignment. She did not hear from Corvath again for several months. When she did, the letter was different. Shorter. Written in a register that had lost most of the flourish and retained something more like the plain language of a person describing their actual experience. He wrote about a woman in the settlement who had been managing the community's water access system for 11 years with tools that needed replacing and had never been replaced because the requests had never made it past the territorial administration. He wrote about what it had taken to understand why those requests had consistently failed to arrive. He did not apologize. She had not asked him to apologize. But something in the letter had changed, and she recognized what it was. She forwarded the water system repair request to the appropriate council committee with a note that it should be treated as urgent. The repairs were completed within 3 weeks. Theron lived in the modest house near the eastern edge of the settlement. Mara knew this because she knew everything about Iron Crest, and because Holt provided regular reports on the territory's general welfare that included, without editorializing, the basic facts of how former Alpha Greymont was getting on. The reports were consistent with each other and with what she had expected. He raged first. The neighbors reported hearing it, not the words, just the sounds, fists on walls, footsteps pacing, and once, late at night, a howl that lasted a long time, and then cut off as though a door had been closed on it. The rage burned for about 3 weeks, which was roughly how long she had expected it to take for a man like Theron to exhaust the fuel that rage required, which was the belief that the situation could be changed by sufficient force of feeling. Then came the bargaining. He sought meetings with Holt, with the remaining council members, with anyone who would receive him. He made arguments about bloodline and institutional continuity and the value of experience. Holt listened to all of it with the patient courtesy of someone who respected the person in front of him while being entirely clear about the limits of what was possible. The council members were less patient. A young warrior named Cass, barely 20 years old, told him directly that the Greymont legacy meant something different to people who had lived under it than to the person who had built it. This, according to Holt's report, was the turning point. Not because the argument was new, Theron had heard versions of it in the Great Hall, but because it came from someone young enough that there was no possible interpretation of it as political positioning. It was simply what Cass thought. It was simply true. The bargaining stopped. Then came the quiet. It lasted longer than the other phases and had a different quality. not the dormancy of someone gathering themselves for another attempt, but the particular stillness of a person who has stopped moving toward something and started slowly and without a clear destination, looking at where they actually were. Holt's reports noted in their careful neutral language that Theron had begun leaving the house. Initially, only in the early mornings, when the settlement was mostly empty, walking the border paths that he had once traveled as Alpha conducting inspections, and now traversed as a private person with no particular destination. Then, at other hours. Then, in the 7th week, he appeared at the Eastern Settlements Community Hall during a meeting about spring planting logistics, and sat in the back row and listened for 2 hours without speaking, and left when it was over. No one asked him to leave. No one made a significant point of his presence. He was not the Alpha. He was not anyone particular. He was a man at a community meeting, which was a thing that required no special explanation. He came back the following week. The week after that, someone asked him a question about the Eastern Ridge drainage patterns, which he had surveyed extensively during his tenure. He answered it. The answer was useful. The meeting continued. This pattern, too, accumulated. Mara did not seek reports on the specifics beyond what Holt provided. She did not ask for more detail. This was not indifference. It was the understanding that there were processes that needed to happen without her observation, that the watched thing and the unwatched thing developed differently, and that what Theron Greymont did with the remainder of his life was his to determine without her management. She had done what needed doing. The rest was not her architecture. What Holt did not include in his reports, because Mara had not asked and because some things did not belong in official documents, was the particular quality of Theron's silence in the weeks after the Great Hall. The rage and the bargaining had their own logic, comprehensible to anyone who had watched powerful people lose the thing their power was built on. But the silence that followed was different. It had a texture that Holt, who had known Theron for 30 years, did not have the right language for. Eldwin found it eventually in the old texts. He had been expecting it, in the way you expect a wound to show its depth, only after the initial shock has passed. Rejection's echo. A condition documented in 3 separate manuscripts across the last 1,000 years, each account describing the same progression in the mate who had chosen to sever the bond, not the rejected mate, the one who had done the rejecting. The wolf spirit, having cut the connection it had been built around, begins to understand what it has lost. And unlike the rejected mate, who carries the wound from the outside, the one who rejected carries it from the inside, where the body knows exactly what it did and cannot unknow it. It was not a punishment the goddess administered. It was simply the consequence of a specific kind of action. The bond she had woven had been cut by the hands of the person she had trusted with it. The wolf that had recognized its mate and been overruled by the man's pride did not recover from that overruling. It did not have the architecture for that particular betrayal because the betrayal had come from within. There was no treatment. Eldwin had checked every source he had access to. The bond, once severed by the one who had initiated it, could not be reformed. The wolf spirit, once overruled on the matter it existed to protect, lost its coherence gradually and completely, the way a fire loses its coherence when the material it burns is gone. He told Holt. He did not tell Mara. This was a judgment call he made alone, and he believed it was the right one. She had enough to carry, and what was happening to Theron Greymont was not her responsibility to manage or her burden to witness. It was simply the operating consequence of choices he had made, proceeding on their own schedule, as consequences do. Through the autumn, Theron's presence at the community meetings became less frequent, then stopped. The early morning walks along the border paths, which Holt had noted as a possible sign of something returning, also stopped. The neighbors reported that the lights in the small house near the eastern edge went out earlier and came on later, and sometimes did not come on at all. On the night of the full moon in late November, exactly 1 year after he had stood on the stone dais in the sacred grove and spoken the words that had set everything in motion, Theron Greymont walked out of his house. He wore a thin tunic, no cloak. His feet were bare against the frozen ground. He walked to the sacred grove the way a person walks when they are no longer deciding where to go, when the direction is simply the one the body has chosen, because the mind has stopped offering alternatives. The bonfire pit was dark and cold, and filled with drifted snow. The stone dais was exactly as it had always been, a flat-topped rock elevated above the clearing floor, unremarkable in daylight, ordinary in every way that things are ordinary when they have been stripped of the context that made them mean something. He climbed it. His bare feet left marks in the snow that were not silver and did not bloom with frost flowers. They were just footprints. The ordinary evidence of a man who had walked somewhere. He stood where he had stood a year ago and looked out at the empty clearing. The moon was up. It was the same moon. It was always the same moon, and it had never once arranged its indifferent light to favor him or to spare him, or to offer him anything other than the specific clarity that full moons offered everyone equally, which was simply the truth of what was there. He reached inside himself for his wolf, for the great silver-eyed creature that had been with him since his first shift at 16, that had recognized Mara Voss in a hallway and surged forward with a certainty that had taken his breath away, that had thrown itself against his will for months before going quiet. He found silence, not the silence of a wolf at rest, the silence of a room where something had been and was no longer. A cold hearth. Ashes where fire had been. He sat down on the stone. He drew his knees to his chest. The cold arrived without the gradual encroachment of cold in ordinary circumstances. It came all at once, the way things come when there is nothing left to resist them. He did not resist it. He had used everything he had on things that had not been worth using it on, and there was nothing left for this. His last coherent thought was not of Iron Crest, or the 12 generations, or the alliances, or the carefully constructed image of a perfect alpha. It was of a girl in a thin dress standing in the snow with her feet bare and her face turned toward him, and the smile she had worn, and the thing he had spent a year trying to understand about it. He understood it now. She had smiled because she had already known she was going to survive this. And she had. They found him at dawn, on the stone, facing the direction of the moon, which had long since set. His expression was not peaceful. It was not anguished. It was the expression of a man who had, in the very last moment available to him, understood the answer to the question he should have asked a year ago. Holt made the arrangements quietly and without ceremony. A grave at the edge of the sacred grove, beneath the oldest pine, marked with a plain stone. No inscription. Theron had spent his life attached to the weight of his name. It seemed appropriate, in the end, to let him rest without it. He reported to Mara the following morning. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me." That was all. Holt nodded and left, and Mara remained at the table with her hands flat on the oak surface and the winter light coming through the windows at a low angle, and she allowed herself, privately and without witnesses, to feel the full weight of what had happened and what had been lost and what had never been possible and what might have been, in a different version of a story that had gone a different way. She sat with it for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and returned to the work. The full moon nights were the difficult ones. She had expected this, and it had still surprised her. The consistency of it. Every month, when the moon came up full and white and merciless over the ridgeline, something in the place where the bond had been reported sensation. Not pain exactly, more like the awareness of an absence. The phantom limb that insisted on existing even after the thing it had been connected to was gone. She dealt with it the way she dealt with most things. She went to the forest, alone, and she stood in the snow or the new grass or the returning wildflowers depending on the month, and she let it be exactly what it was for as long as it needed to be. And then she walked back. Eldwin knew. Sira suspected. Draven, who was old enough to have seen most things and wise enough not to require everything to be spoken, simply made sure she had what she needed in the morning and did not ask questions she had not invited. She did not speak of Theron, not in council, not in private, not in the forest on the full moon nights. His name was a door she had closed and sealed with the practical finality of someone who understood that some doors, if they were going to stay closed, could not be opened for examination. She had made her peace with what had been done and what had been lost and what remained. And the peace was real, even if it was the kind of peace that lived alongside rather than replacing something. She governed. She listened. She remembered names. She made decisions with the specific combination of firmness and openness that came from understanding systems from the inside. She was not a queen in any of the ways that word was typically performed. She wore the circlet in formal settings and set it on the table beside her water cup in working sessions. She ate in the Great Hall, and she also ate in the community kitchens when she was moving through the settlement, and it was mealtime, and someone offered. Under her sovereignty, the territories entered what the chroniclers would later call the Moonbloom Age, a period characterized not by the dramatic markers of conquest and expansion, but by the slower, more durable markers of a system that had learned to function for everyone within it. The border villages received adequate resources. The healers received adequate supplies. The young wolves who had been passed over for training and advancement because of their family names began to move through the structure on the basis of their actual capabilities. The world did not transform overnight. It transformed in the way water transforms stone, through persistence and patience and the accumulated pressure of consistent intention over time. In the second year of her reign, on a morning in late autumn when the first snow had just returned to the upper ridges, a child named Wren followed Mara into the sacred grove. Wren was 7 years old, belonged to one of the settlement families, and had the particular quality of attention that very young children sometimes have. Total and unfiltered and not subject to the social modulation that older people apply to their curiosity. She had been watching Mara for 3 days with the focused interest of someone working on a problem. The sacred grove was still the sacred grove. The ancient bonfire pit was there. The stone dais was there. And at the edge of the clearing, Beneath a pine that had been old when the grove was first consecrated, there was a grave marked with a simple stone, and beside the stone, fresh evergreen boughs laid with a careful hand. Wren looked at the grave. She looked at the boughs, which were not wilted, which had been placed recently. "Who is that?" she said. Mara looked at the grave for a moment. "Someone who lived here," she said. Wren considered this. "Why are there flowers? My mother puts flowers on graves when she wants to remember someone she misses." "These aren't quite that kind of flowers," Mara said. Wren looked at her with the direct patience of someone who intends to understand. "Then what kind are they?" Mara was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines above them, a sound like something breathing slowly and deliberately. The mark beneath her cloak pulsed once, steady and warm. "A long time ago," she said, "something very unkind happened to a girl in this clearing. She was hurt here, in front of many people, and no one helped her." She paused. "She survived it. She went on and built something real, and she is not broken, and she does not need rescuing." She looked at the grave, then at Wren. "But the place where the hurt happened is still real, and it deserves to be remembered. Not the person who caused it, the girl who survived it." Wren looked at the boughs. She looked at the stone. She processed this with the seriousness it deserved. "Is the girl okay now?" she asked. Mara looked at the grave for a long moment, at the boughs she had placed there herself 2 days ago, as she did every month, at the stone that marked the place where the cost of cruelty had been paid in full by the person who had chosen it. "Yes," she said, "she is." Wren reached down and touched the edge of one of the evergreen boughs with 2 fingers, gently, the way you touch something that matters. "I think it's kind," she said, "to remember someone who was hurt here, even if she's okay now." Mara looked at her. Something in her chest moved, not the ache of the Bond's ghost, but something different. Something that was simply the feeling of being seen accurately by someone who had no reason to see her as anything other than what she was. "I think so too," she said. They stood together in the grove for a while longer, the woman and the child, in the cold, clear air of early winter, while the snow came down in small, patient flakes, and the ancient pines held their silence around them, and the moon, already visible at the edge of the afternoon sky, began its slow rise over the ridge. Mara placed her hand briefly on the stone. Then she turned and walked back toward the great hall, her white cloak trailing in the new snow, the circlet catching the last of the winter light, and Wren walked beside her, and the grove was quiet behind them, and the boughs on the grave were green against the white, and would remain green for another month until she came back to replace them, as she always did, as she intended to keep doing, not for him, for the girl who had stood in the snow with bare feet and a borrowed smile, and had already known she would survive it. That girl deserved to be remembered. That girl deserved flowers.